Good. Hey, you talked about the proof of concept that you did with Snowflake early on. Could you go into some detail on that? What were you trying to accomplish and what kind of benefits did you get?
Yeah, yeah, I certainly can. I mean, I think that the core of the answer to that question goes back to where we were struggling with Hadoop. So let me kind of start there. So we did get our enterprise platform on Hadoop. It was operating. It was just about working. But as we made more data available through Hadoop and we threw more workload at the machines, right, we were just running out of CPU and memory. And ultimately, even though there's some ways to manage CPU and memory, we then started just hitting the point where the hard drives, we couldn't get the data off the hard drives fast enough to keep up with demand, which means there's a couple of different ways you can go. You can buy new stacks of servers, material capital expense and some pretty lengthy implementation times typically, or you can start trying to cut workload or constrain workload, or you can start splintering workload and effectively go back to the old SQL Server days, right, where you're having to reblend data or you're managing multiple platforms. So the issue we were primarily dealing with was scalability, fluid scalability and concurrency of load. I think the other pressing issue was that we were really in this, do we overbuy or do we underbuy question. We're a relatively spiky business. Q4 as a commerce company is much, much bigger for us than the other quarters of the year. So we had to effectively buy the hardware to cover the peak loads, but then a lot of the time that was relatively inefficient, and we had to try and balance in between, which left us in a situation where we weren't super satisfied either with the low time performance or with the high time performance. So I think as we were looking at a migration to the cloud, we wanted to see a couple of key things, and this is how we evaluated the different platforms that we looked at. And the platforms that we looked at are the players you'd imagine in the space. Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake. We looked at Azure, etc. The key questions that we came down to are, one, can we get the data into this platform fast enough that we can get close to real-time analytics back out without having to jump through too many hoops, right? So it's relatively important for us that at least in some areas we can see what's happening today, what's happening right now, or 5 minutes ago at least. So question one, can we get the data in there fast enough? Question two for us really was around concurrency. I've got hundreds and hundreds of users using these platforms extensively all day, right? We're a business that runs on data. So I have very high, for the size of company, I have very high concurrency demands and honestly pretty high expectations from my end users about what the performance should look like. People get bored after about 5 seconds in my experience. So, unless a system could viably handle multiple hundred people concurrently with average query times in the range of a couple of seconds, then it wasn't really going to work for us. Another key point is we wanted a platform where we didn't have to maintain separate data lakes, data warehouses, and then reporting layers. I've always struggled with that architecture and then having to, pick different data sets or different technologies just to do different parts of what I think of as analytics. So we really wanted a solution that could give us all three in one. We also wanted a solution that was really quite fully featured when it comes to SQL. Our main interaction language with the data is still SQL. And, we wanted it to be as fully featured as possible and do a lot of things by default. And ultimately, by the time you put those conditions out there, we sort of whittled down the competitors. And the one that really worked best for us is Snowflake. I'm not saying that would be everyone's decision, but that's where we got to, evaluating it along those conditions.
And are you using it very broadly now throughout the organization?
Yeah, I mean, Yes, is the simple answer.
If you could, to kind of tick off a few of the uses, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I tend to talk about it and think about it as the enterprise data hub. So, other than our internal HR data, you will find pretty much any data that you need within the company is in Snowflake. We add to it continuously as new projects or new initiatives stand up. We have, beyond my team logging in, and my team service in one way or another most parts of the business, directly or indirectly, and my team are obviously routinely in there and will drive everything from Snowflake in terms of providing data. But we then have, users either directly in Snowflake or using Tableau on top of Snowflake throughout every business unit in the company. It is used to verify all of our financial statements, to meet our audit requirements. It's used in marketing planning. We use it to feed data out to third-party platforms that we work with, including, Google, as well as our boutique vendors that work on our TV advertising spend optimization. It's used in product analytics, customer segmentation. It's used in B2B reporting and modeling and projections. So we use it. I mean, it'd be, other than HR and our internal HR data, it's used pretty much any way you could think of, to a greater or lesser extent.
Yeah. Oh, that's great for Snowflake, and obviously you like it too. Yeah. So let me drill down here. What you look at this whole array of uses, of applications where you do use Snowflake as a component. Pick one, maybe the most ambitious project you're working on that has Snowflake as a key component of it. Can you describe that? It may be something that's really new.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key components that we offer back out to our members is Cashback, right? That's kind of what we do. And there's, as you earn Cashback on our site, there are multiple different ways in which you can do so. And clearly your sensitivity to different cashback rates, what maybe merchants are interested in offering at cashback rate levels, can vary. So there is an initiative within a large-scale initiative that is core-powered with Snowflake to really dig in and understand how would we vary the cashback rates for different members in different situations and for different merchants. Literally trying to get down to the point where, as an individual, one of our multi-millions of members, you will have customized rates, ideally focused on where you have a core interest. And how does Snowflake play into that? Well, we use Snowflake as the control mechanism for that. So we pull, there's a lot of potential data points that go into making those kind of decisions about what rates should be offered and to who and when and why, and how then they should be communicated out. Snowflake, first of all, stores all the information that you would use to make those decisions. Right, it's the primary repository for all the kind of the component parts, whether it's your previous shopping history, whether it's direct consumer feedback through, you telling us what your favorite stores are, whether it's clickstream data or other types of data that could inform those decisions. The models then to decide which members may be interested in what offers and on what merchants are then calculated largely within Snowflake. Today, every now and then we will do some feature engineering within Snowflake and pass some of that logic through a separate data engineering tool, but ultimately the results of that get written back into Snowflake. And Snowflake is effectively the production system store for that member personalization data. It's then passed on from Snowflake into various kind of API layers, so our applications or communications can be customized. But it's really the hub of that entire project. And really that gets to the core value, it's sort of a quantum leap in terms of the core value proposition that the business is offering, which is, who gets what cashback rate and when, and how do we make that as compelling as possible for both our merchant partners and our consumers.
That's a great project. Over the past 5 years, AI, and in particular machine learning, have really become mainstream in the enterprise, used for lots of different applications, and lots of different kinds of technology are being used. So I wanted to find out how you're using AI, or in particular machine learning, and how that fits with your use of Snowflake's technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use machine learning and AI in multiple different areas. Certainly, personalization for the members is a big one. We also use it in areas like financial planning, risk management, fraud detection. I think like any other big visible company, that is something we unfortunately have to deal with and manage. So, understanding that, as well as doing things for our merchant partners to do with modeling of, what would we expect the response to be for certain cashback rates within certain audiences or certain targeting criteria. But all machine learning, artificial intelligence derived, at least in part. When we start thinking about Snowflake's involvement, and I'm going to simplify a little bit here, but I tend to think in kind of the components of a data science project, or even better, the components of a data science implementation. So often, I would say typically with a data science implementation, if you're looking at a new one, you have to go through a couple of phases. There's the initial feature engineering. You've got to produce the data that you want to try and train a model on, or train the AI on in the first place. Then you go through a phase of actually training the models, building the models, deciding which model is going to be the best. And then ideally, and I think, and honestly, over the years, I've seen this as the biggest struggle, is you've then actually got to find a way to get the output of that model back in and making a difference. Otherwise, I owe this analogy to a data scientist I worked with several years ago. You end up just building stuff and sticking it on a shelf, right? And it looks very pretty, but it doesn't really do anything for you. So where Snowflake enters that picture is it sort of the start and the end of that process. Increasingly, what I'm finding is the traditional feature engineering that we had been doing using R or Python and sort of spilling out into different systems, we're just doing it in Snowflake. It's easier to do it with SQL. More people can work on it. We can optimize the cost more efficiently. And also what we're finding then is that these feature sets that are built can become data artifacts that we can use for other purposes in and of themselves, because it's just SQL that we can run on a repeated basis. And we actually make data available for visualization, analytics, or other purposes, as a side benefit almost. What we then typically do is we would feature engineer in Snowflake, drop the data then into SageMaker. We tend to use SageMaker as our data science platform. Run and train the models within SageMaker. And then what we do from there is we pipe the data back into Snowflake. Well, why would we do that? Well, because it's pretty easy then to make use of that data. Snowflake, like I said, is already connected into a lot of downstream applications, certainly for internal analytics and visualization, but it's also directly connected to our email tool. We use message gears for marketing and email. So there's no real gap there. We've also already got technology that can pipe data into Kafka streams or into API layers to make immediate use of that data. So that traditional, we built it and it sits on the shelf problem really gets reduced if the output of the model can be written back into Snowflake, which is already connected to the downstream applications and uses. So there's a little bit of a long story, but I would say, as we look at Snowflake today, increasingly it is taking the upfront feature engineering work and the downstream implementation of the data. We are still using separate tools for the model building and testing.
Mark, right now I'd like to ask you to be a bit of a visionary. Looking ahead 5 years or more, what changes do you see coming in cloud data analytics, both the technologies and how they're applied to business?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. And it's one that I've really been starting to ask myself. I think because at this point, I think if you asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, we were running with Hadoop. It was a good technology. The cloud platforms were just starting to really hit material scale. And the technology was still almost standing in the way of the use. I think with the evolution of the cloud platforms over the last couple of years, the technology, and I've literally been in meetings where I've said this, the technology is getting out of the way. Like, I don't have to worry about, can I parse through a 100 terabyte table anymore? Of course I can. It's not even a problem. It's just a matter of, am I willing to pay to do it? It isn't an issue doing it. The question for me then becomes, okay, if the technology is getting out of the way, what should a data platform be doing, not what can it do? And I do feel like that's a fundamental shift in attitude and an outlook that I'm looking at, and I know other people around me are looking at. The way I tend to think about this is I think about what are the things that a data platform should be doing. And some of them are pretty clear and pretty well understood and well known. You know, it should be offering good storage. It should be offering good compute, ideally with good concurrency. You should be able to visualize your data. You should be able to do things with the data pretty effectively, like sending email or making the data available via APIs. There are then some other components which I think that the industry is really just starting to wrap its arms around. Data cataloging and data discovery. You know, one of the things when you've got a petabyte of data in a cloud database, unless you're an expert on that cloud database, how are you supposed to find anything in there? It's probably divided into thousands of tables. There's nuances on all of them. So how are you supposed to do that? And I'm not saying that there aren't vendors out there doing that, but I do think that that's going to be, over the next couple of years, there's going to be an evolution there. Because having all this data is one thing. Being able to actually find what you need in a scalable way, I think is still a growing edge for the industry. And in particular, I think being able to do that in an environment where you're not having to jump into other tools or you're not having to jump into partial solutions is still really not within the scope of anything I've seen today. The other big thing I see coming, and I think with the release of the GDPR laws in Europe, with CCPA coming out to California, Brazil just enacted new laws. I think Japan has now got much stricter privacy laws in place. I think the notion of data governance and really focusing on what is the balance between the collection of and use of large amounts of data, and what are the consumer's rights around that data is still an area that's relatively difficult to manage. I know that we have put a lot of time and effort, especially around CCPA, because we've got a big presence in California, to make sure that we're looking at the spirit of that law, not just the letter of the law, and thinking about what that means for us in the long term. And I do think that there is another wave of innovation that is likely to happen, helping companies to really make that shift from store everything and make use of what you need when you need it, to store what makes sense and be able to do it in a way that works for the consumers and isn't overly invasive and isn't overly problematic and doesn't allow for sort of unmitigated use in situations that weren't intended by the consumer. And it's really important to us. I mean, this is where we led off, right? Like, we take our communication and our service offering with our consumers very, very seriously. That's a core value proposition. We don't have a business without the consumers. And those laws, in a way, were a challenge to really look at that from a data point of view and think, are we doing enough here? And what do we need to do better, or what would we want to do better to make sure that we can stand up in front of our consumers and say that we're doing everything we can and really following the spirit of these evolving conversations around privacy and control of your own personal data.
Oh, that's great. Hey, I wanted to drill down here a little bit on something. I mean, when I think about your business, one of the core attributes of your business is that you are compensating the consumer for information. They give you a lot of information about yourself. In return, they get a discount. But when you look across the whole field of marketing and retailing and online retailing, in a lot of cases that's not so. And people have been talking for years about the whole idea of will businesses have to pay the consumer for the information they provide? Do you see that ever happening?
I see it happening in some places. I think in some situations, I mean, consumers have been offered money for insight for years, right? I mean, consumer research groups, there's entire companies built on, sending out surveys and collecting information back. And that's a very deliberate form of that. I think for a lot of businesses, do I think it's going to become that explicit or that transactional? No, not necessarily. I think there will be an evolution, though, in the way that we think about the storage of data and the value proposition that the product is providing back to the consumer. So, I mean, my understanding, just going back to our business, and my understanding of our consumers is that, they understand that we have to track certain things. Like, clearly, we need to know where they're shopping to be able to give them cash back at those stores, right? Like there's a basic level of data and information there that the program doesn't work if there isn't an agreement that we will hold that information, right? We need to know where you went shopping, what the cashback rate was offered at the time. We need to know and to some extent, we need to know what you spent, right? Because otherwise we can't make sure that we're giving you the cashback that you want. And I think the question becomes what additional information is collected as part of that. Are the consumers comfortable with the additional data that's collected? And do they see that there is enough of a value proposition with the product that they are willing that data to be collected? I think that it gets even more complicated, or that calculation becomes even more complicated, where potentially a lot of services, us included out there, but I mean, this is true of a lot of services, is that the data is collected with the intention of improving the consumer experience, genuinely. I mean, I think that I can stand up and say that is definitely what we are doing. If we're collecting information, it's because we want to try and improve the consumer experience in terms of making it easier to find what you're looking for, in terms of offering you the best deals so that you don't miss a deal, right? When it's out there. And I think the difficulty comes from the fact that sometimes you don't know what information will help to improve the customer experience. And this is a conversation that's happening around how much data is it right to collect from a consumer with the understanding that you're trying to improve that experience if you then don't find a use for that data, or it doesn't prove particularly beneficial. I do think that there will be a growing understanding of that dynamic. I think it's already there to a certain extent, but I think that understanding from consumers will get deeper and will get a little bit more sophisticated over time as some of these conversations that were, about privacy and about data collection online and about security online become more a component of our kind of national and international conversations.
Right. Mark, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Your stories, your insights about what you do with data and how you've been doing it is really fascinating. I loved hearing kind of that operational stuff about how you combine analytics and engineering in your company and how that really improves communications and makes the technologies that your engineering people more useful and more used. I thought that was fascinating. And also just the story of the evolution that the company's taken over the past few years and how how it does its big data analytics, from the SQL Server to the Hadoop, and then finally to Snowflake and the Cloud Data Warehouse. So it's been really interesting. I think the listeners today are going to find it very interesting. So thanks again for your time.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. And thank you for letting me share some of this. It's a really interesting conversation and a really interesting time to be having this conversation.
That does it for this episode of Rise of the Data Cloud. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by Snowflake. To see how you can get secure and easy access to any data with near infinite scalability, visit snowflake.com.